The importance of resilience in the mental health and development of our youth has been threaded into each of the presentations and discussion sessions through the day, highlighting the importance of resilient science and how we conceptualize, we choose to promote healing and growth on our use of our youth. And who better to take us deeper into this exploration than TMI Scientific Board member, Dr. Sherry Hamby. Sherry, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're having a good day. I caught a little of the end of the last session, and that sounded terrific. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about, as Etione said, about resilience. And I guess what I am mostly hoping to leave you with is something that he mentioned too, is that our old ways of thinking about it, that they're just a matter of it's just toughness or grit or somehow pushing through, that those came from some very old ideas back in the 1970s and 80s that we do now know are basically wrong, and we have a lot of evidence that they're wrong. But it's turned out to be a very sticky concept, I think, because especially in mainstream US culture, it's such an individualistic society, and we really like this cowboy mentality. And so I think the idea that like resilience is all about toughness kind of resonates with some deep-seated, currents in our cultural narratives. But I'm here today anyway to try to push against those currents and try to convince you that you should think about it another way, and basically to try to think about it in terms of, like Etione said, of something that's more holistic, more comprehensive, and that allows spaces for us to help each other and to think about the other kinds of things in our lives that really have probably helped almost everybody here put together the pieces of a good life after experiencing trauma. So I think one of the ways to understand where we are with this, because we've made so much progress in the last 10 or 15 years, is just to take a very short trip through the last 50 or so years of work on trauma and resilience. And of course, when the 20th century, so I went to graduate school in the 1980s and 1990s. You know, back in those days, the big thing that was happening is that we were applying the tools of science to violence and trauma really for the first time, and that as part of that, we were discovering that there was way more trauma and way more violence than we had ever believed before. Child abuse, bullying, didn't matter what problem you looked at, it was much more common than official records had ever indicated. And also that it was much more harmful in terms of depression or PTSD or substance misuse or suicidality. Those are the kinds of things that we tended to look at back in those days. And that is all very true and very important. In fact, I think you could even say that it's the most important social science that's ever been conducted, because it just had a huge, huge impact on our society. We made all these enormous investments in child protective services and domestic violence shelters and rape crisis hotlines. And we came up with specialized police units and courts for family violence or for gang violence. And we developed all of these school curricula and for bullying and all these other kinds of problems. And of course, we changed all kinds of laws and things like that. So it was incredibly impactful science. But at the same time, it did get a couple of things wrong. The first one that it got wrong is that, and maybe some of you have been like me, have been around old enough to remember this, but is that we used to look at all of these problems one at a time. So we would either study bullying or we would study child abuse. And it would have been very unusual, even right up, certainly through the 90s, but even into the early 21st century, for you to see a paper that thought about both of those issues at the same time. Although it does turn out that those populations have a huge amount of overlap, and that kids who are getting abused in the home are at much higher risk for getting bullied at school as well. But around the turn of the century, and especially with the adverse childhood experiences surveys, we started to realize that a lot of these things were linked to each other, and that what was really driving a lot of the negative outcomes that we'd been looking at was our cumulative lifetime dosage or exposure. So you either call that ACEs, or in the work I did with David Finkelhor and Heather Turner, we called it polyvictimization. Some people call it complex trauma. I mean, that dose idea was getting captured in a lot of different ways. And we now understand that because all of these exposures where as far as we know, our body is responding to them in pretty similar ways as far as our stress response. So as far as like flooding our body with stress hormones and raising our heart rate and our blood pressure, and then, dialing down our immune system, our digestion, all that sort of stuff. And over time, that kind of exposure to chronic stress can have lifelong consequences on all kinds of markers of things that they call allostatic load in the neuroscience area, although you can just think of it as wear and tear on the body. And that wear and tear is probably a lot of the reason for some of the very long-term effects that we see from exposure to trauma. So famously, in the first adverse childhood experiences studies, for example, they found really strong links between exposure to childhood adversity and even factors like heart disease and cancer and diabetes in these older samples that were 50, 60, 70 some years old. Ah, and that did really shift our understanding of violence. I mean, I think it was a real revolutionary change in our perspective. But it also, what it has done more recently is it has really created a revolution on the resilience side or the healing side of things too, because now we understand that we can take this same idea of dosage and put it on the recovery side of the equation. And it turns out that Ah, much more so than we recognized back in the 80s and 90s, that most people, including most children, are resilient after trauma. Most kids, even kids who've been exposed to child abuse or things like that, are still meeting developmental milestones, achieving social goals in their development and things like that. It's There's a lot more positive outcomes than we like to think about, as harmful as it is. And we don't know very much, and we didn't ask the question for a long time about how do we get to those positive outcomes. It's definitely not because the trauma is no big deal. Oh, and it turns out it doesn't really hurt you. We've got thousands of studies showing really long-term harms. And in fact, for things like heart disease and cancer and diabetes, most of the time, if you go online now to like the, American Cancer Foundation or some of those kinds of things, and you look at more behavioral types of risk factors, they're always talking about diet and exercise. But in fact, the links to early exposure to trauma are stronger than the links to diet and exercise. And if we could figure out a way to eliminate or at least greatly reduce exposure to childhood trauma, we could probably make a much bigger impact on these long-term disabling serious disease conditions than if even all of us went out and started exercising and eating perfectly tomorrow, which is really a remarkable idea. But what we've tried to do in our work is we've tried to take this dosage idea and really start to apply it to the healing side of the equation. And in particular, I've been working with Vicky Banyard and dozens of other people. And one of the main things that we have been trying to figure out is which strengths matter the most. Because, of course, if you are doing a therapy program where you might have 6 sessions or 12 sessions, or even if you've got 26 sessions, you're not going to be able to promote every single possible good thing that you could in that period of time. Or if you're developing a program for a school curriculum, you've got to know where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Would you get more benefit if you focused on emotion regulation or social support or grit or attachment? Or I mean, there's dozens of different choices. So what we have been doing for the last 12 or 13 years is really trying to drill down and answer this question. And we are working with a model that we call the resilience portfolio model. And the idea behind the portfolio name is to capture that multidimensionality that Etienne mentioned, and for us to understand that there's no one size fits all solution to what's going to help people overcome trauma. And in fact, we've looked at things like self-reliance and determination and persistence and impulse control, and those aren't even in the top tier of factors that it turns out helps people overcome trauma. So we work with this model, and in this model, we have found, both from reviewing tons and tons and tons of other people's work as well as from our own, that there are 4 main domains that we need to focus on, and that we really need to be thinking about these. I mean, whether you're talking about our kids or if we're in schools or clients or whatever context you're thinking about, these are things that everybody needs to have a little bit of in their life. And so the first domain is meaning making. That means connecting to something larger than yourself. Could be a role like parent or teacher, or it could be a mission like my mission, which is to reduce the global burden of trauma. Could be a set of beliefs like religious beliefs or cultural traditions or practices, but something that's bigger than you, that you are kind of hitching your own boat to, if you will. And then the second domain is the regulatory domain. So we do think that it is important that you do need to figure out how to manage your emotions and behaviors. And of course, with kids, that is probably one of the biggest developmental challenges, and one that even people my age still struggle with sometimes. But we don't but there's a lot more in that bucket, I guess is what I'll say now. I'm going to come back to all of these in terms of, it's not just grit or it's not just determination or things like that. There's a lot of different ways to think about what you need to have a well-regulated life. And then the third domain are interpersonal relationships. And we like to think of that not just in terms of our closest loved ones, so family or friends, or, but the broader social ecology too. So certainly in the context of what we're talking about today, teachers, coaches, scout leaders, things like that. But maybe even the broader neighborhood networks that really sustain us in ways that we don't always appreciate. So the librarian, or the people who show up with their food at the farmer's market on the weekends, and all of the things that kind of help rise us all up and help us all get to a place of thriving. And then the fourth domain, which we have not been very good about including. It is a long time to think of this. My training is in clinical psychology, and as much as I like to think I have moved beyond that lens, and most of the time I do like to think I've moved beyond that lens, but it still trips me up sometimes. So we worked with this model for several years, and we're really even kind of patting ourselves on the back about how ecological it was before we realized that we hadn't considered the physical environment. So now we bring in the physical environment too, which can have really profound healing properties, and that can mean access to the natural environment, or it can also mean features of the built environment. And so, what I wanted to do today, that's kind of the big picture overview of what we've been keeping busy with for the last some years, is to take you through our findings so far. And I want to revisit each one of those domains and tell you, I think, one of the most interesting things that we have found in each one of these domains. So, we have been doing a lot of studies. We have conducted studies. I think we're up to like 19 or different data sets that include altogether more than 30,000 different participants. Those really big numbers like that are from survey-based research, but we have also done more than 200 one-on-one face-to-face interviews and a number of focus groups. So we have taken a mixed methods approach with qualitative and quantitative data. We have been out in the field in 10 countries and counting, as well as many different communities in the United States, especially. We have also been conducting a number of scoping reviews. We did a special issue in trauma, violence, and abuse last year that was all resilience portfolio scoping reviews, but my students and I have conducted several other ones as well. So we've really been making an intense effort to distill. I mean, a lot of times people don't even necessarily know what they have got in terms of their contributions to what I like to call, Susan Yoon and I call a science of healing. Uh, but we've read hundreds and hundreds of papers in other areas now to try to distill that. And this is where we kind of stand right now, sort of fresh off the boat. Actually, I have a little data I'm sitting on. I haven't even had a chance to analyze yet, but this is pretty up to date. So I'm going to go back and start with meaning making. So in the meaning making domain, uh, I mean, first, I think it's worth commenting on that this is a domain that I think is neglected in a lot of psychology spaces. It is, of course, a topic that's received a ton of research, and especially in positive psychology. And there are very well-known people like Crystal Park, for example, who have devoted their careers mostly to the study of this concept. But still, it is nonetheless, I think, neglected in a lot of spaces. You don't see it very much in mainstream work on trauma and violence, certainly, and it's not a central part of most mainstream therapies, at least as they are manualized. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, uh, doesn't really focus on helping people find meaning making. Probably the biggest exception to that would be Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which some of you might be familiar with. Although I did a presentation in a class of graduate students in Arizona yesterday, and I asked them how many of them had heard of Viktor Frankl or logotherapy, and not a single solitary one of them had. But so I don't think it's a very, it's not unfortunately a very popular therapy, but I do think he was onto something. Viktor Frankl, for those of you who know, was a Holocaust survivor, and he thought that when he was in the camps that the difference between people who survived and people who didn't was mostly yeah, well, TFCBT, it can in the sense of it does help with construct the narrative, and narrative expo and interventions I do think are someone's in the chat saying TFCBT focus on meaning making as a central part of the intervention. I think that they focus on creating the narrative. I don't know how much explicit coaching there is on meaning making per se in terms of helping people identify a mission or a role or a set of beliefs to guide them. Although I do think that all of those narrative interventions, I would also include like narrative exposure therapy or things like that, are great for promoting meaning making and definitely one of the best ways for promoting meaning making. Um, but it was the central part of logotherapy was to help people find that, because he found that people who had found some sort of mission or role, like maybe they were trying to do first aid for the other uh, prisoners in the camps or something like that, that those were the ones that seemed to do better. And then he kind of centered his therapeutic approach around that. It has had some scientific evaluations, but certainly not as much as many other kinds of therapy have. But I still thought, I mean, so we brought this in because of the reading that we had done, but I still thought that it was going to be very hard. We have looked so far at more than 70 different types of strengths, so good things that people can have in their lives, whether they're individual assets or external resources. And a lot of them, like social support or grit or attachment or emotion regulation, all of these things, they have many of them have these very big camps of researchers who were big boosters for these things. And so I thought what was going to be the real challenge was trying to narrow them down. As I mentioned earlier, there's no way you're going to be able to write a therapeutic manual or a school curriculum that targets 60 or 70 different strengths to develop. So we're going to have to narrow that down to a more manageable number. And I thought that that was going to be a very difficult task, but it's actually turned out that when you review the literature and when you run multivariate analyses where we're really doing head-to-head comparisons. So of course all these things are good, but if we put them in multivariate analyses where you're really looking for the ones that have the strongest unique association with outcomes, then which of those really are the best? And it has turned out that probably 50 or so have just not shown any promise at all. And even more surprising than that, that there has really been one that so far has just stood head and shoulders above all of our other factors that we've looked at, and that's been a sense of purpose. Ah, and I know you are focusing on kids here, and so I just also want to specifically say that we have studied adolescents in a couple of different samples, young people down to age 10, and it has been true for adolescents too. I think that sometimes with kids, we are not very good about thinking about their sense of purpose, but I think that many of them are starting. I mean, even little kids will ask them, what do they want to be when they grow up? And that is essentially a meaning-making process that they're experimenting with. Like, one week they want to be a vet, and another week they want to be a firefighter, and but they're trying on different types of identities and different types of meaning-making pursuits when they do that. And I think we need to be doing more to be developing that, because we have seen that this is one of the best predictors even for the adolescents and especially for the adults. So that has been, that was a real surprise to me about how quickly it was that we could just narrow it down, and how there was just one that seemed so much better than all the others that we have looked at. If you move on to interpersonal relationships, I think one of the most interesting things that we have found really came from a scoping review that one of my students did. And she did this scoping review on resilience among ICU nurses. And she picked the topic because her mom was an ICU nurse during the pandemic, and she saw the enormous toll that it was taking on them. And I'm sure probably almost everybody here today is familiar with the concept of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And and I was familiar with it too. I already knew that it was stressful to be in these first responder jobs or in these healthcare jobs, and that you're getting a lot of indirect and sometimes even direct exposures to trauma as part of this work. And that does add to our lifetime cumulative trauma dosage. So we have to figure out ways to navigate that if we're going to stay in this field, or any similar kind of first responder or human or healthcare services fields. And And that's why it is also important to think about the dosage element, because, of course, although some people do find it very stressful, there are people who manage to sustain this work and still manage to basically achieve and sustain a lot of well-being and thriving over the course of it. And we haven't asked that question enough. But one of the things that came out from this ICU nurses study was, well, first of all, let me say that one of the things that really struck me was how differently every single solitary one of these papers talked about their population they were focusing on, talked about the ICU nurses. It was so positive, it's so respectful, even often using terms like heroic or hero or things like that very explicitly in the papers. Whereas if you read a lot of studies about child abuse or bullying or domestic violence or whatever else it is, I mean, people are trying to be nice for the most part, although I have seen some that I'm not even sure I would describe it as nice. But I think a lot of it is also, uh, you know, does portray them as being fairly pitiful and sometimes even pathetic or helpless, or sometimes even more negatively, like they're in denial or they can't cope or things like that. And so one of the first things that struck me was how different this literature was, even though in some ways their trauma exposure and how it's affecting them is not really that different. But one of the things that that led to is that they were asking them about a lot of kinds of things that you never see in the literature, even on the literature on healing or recovery on or resilience for these other types of victims. And one of the things that they talked about a lot in here was the difference between social support and social leisure, is what we're calling it. And so people in the field do, and of course in the general public even more so, but they tend to use social support in these very broad terms, and it can just mean almost any kind of relationship and almost anything happening in it. But most of the time when we say social support, we do mean some kind of help or assistance that we're offering for somebody who's distressed or is having a problem or needs to cope with something like that. And uh, that is all well and good, and sometimes we all need that, certainly, I mean, myself included. But if you're working in this field and every time you come home from a shift at the hospital, you're in need of that kind of social support, you're probably not going to last in this work very long. And so, what a lot of these nurses were telling these other researchers is that they weren't looking for this constant stream of social support. And sometimes, even when they were getting programs from the hospital or whatever that seemed angled in that way, they didn't even really like them. But what they did say really mattered for helping to sustain them over the long haul was having strong social leisure and making sure that they were really protecting that time and carving out that time so that they were still spending time, just normal time like we all do, or maybe that's not the right word, but just enjoyable time like we all do, just going out to dinner or going to see the movies or a concert or just taking a walk together in a park. I mean, it didn't really matter that much what they were doing, but just that they weren't letting work kind of take over their lives and that they were still investing in the interpersonal domain in their resilience portfolio, to put it in the language of my model. None of them talked about it that way, of course, but that was what helped sustain them over the long haul. And now we have done some work to develop a measure that tried to capture that in the way that these ICU nurses were talking about it, because we couldn't find a tool that we felt was capturing it the way they were talking about it in what were mostly qualitative studies. And we rolled that out in a couple of samples, and that is already like vaulting into the top group. I think it's already clearly in the top 5 or 10 factors that we have looked at out of these 70 or so, in terms of things that seem most closely associated with really thriving. And I think that this kind of thing, I mean, so far we have mostly looked at this in adults, but I think that this sort of thing is really important for kids too, and that we need to really understand that we should be investing in that. Everybody needs that safe space to tell their story, that safe space to create a narrative, like it like happens in TFCBT and things like that. But we don't want to stay there. We need to shift pretty quickly to other kinds of approaches and helping people visualize what their future is going to be like. So this kind of finding would call for spending more of our time when we're working with kids, investing on helping them develop their social networks and not just letting them rely on us as therapists or when teachers or whatever role we're in as their social network, because that's not going to give them the kind of social leisure that they're going to need to sustain their well-being over time. In the environmental domain, as I said, we were slow to add this one and slow to think of it, but this turns out to be an incredibly powerful factor that I also think that in a lot of traditional psychological and educational and social work spaces, we tend not to think of as much as we should. But now there is a huge, huge body of literature on nature interventions of different kinds. Probably one of the best known is Shinrin Yoku. It's a, or that's usually translated in English as forest bathing. And I get asked all the time if that involves nudity in the forest, and it does not. Although, if you want to get nude in the forest, I have no personal objections to that. But the idea behind it is just a loose translation from the Japanese, is that you're sort of immersing yourself in the realm of the forest. And so one of the things they do that I think is kind of important about that particular nature-based intervention is they try to separate it out from exercise. So obviously exercise is really good for you too. It's really good for kids. And as many of you probably know, you can get results on things like depression and anxiety, and also on a number of these markers of chronic trauma exposure that you see with allostatic load that match psychotherapy or psychotropic medications just with exercise, just with 4 or 5 days a week of 30 minutes of exercise. But you can get that with forest bathing too. They've done quite a large number of randomized controlled trials now, especially a lot in Japan and in South Korea. And they get the same thing, that they can show effect sizes or impacts that are similar to cognitive behavioral therapy or medication on all of these factors. And now they also, because you're getting in this environmental factors, that they're having all these impacts on these physiological markers too. So it's boosting your immune system, reducing markers of chronic inflammation, lowering your blood pressure and your heart rate and all these sorts of things, and not just self-report of depression and anxiety or things like that. And the exciting stuff about that is that this is not really work that I do, but there's a whole field of research that's going on that's starting to figure out why that might be the case. And, of course, we co-evolved in environments that were largely, forest or grasslands or, or blue spaces like beaches and lakes and things like that. And they now think that there are things like the phytoncides, which are these organic compounds that plants and trees release, that it's the stuff that makes rosemary smell like rosemary and pine trees smell like pine trees, and that's probably one of the reasons that it's having these effects on us, that they are looking at things like exposure to healthy bacteria. We probably are living in environments that are really too sterile for our own good. And, as I'm sure everybody here knows, we talk about ourselves, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, and I think about myself as a single entity. I'm like one human, but that's not really a very good description of this massive cells and stuff that's walking around, because I'm host for, and all of us are, billions or maybe even trillions of different kinds of bacteria. And and potentially other life forms too. And that if we are healthy and feel healthy, it's because we are being good caretakers for all of the other little critters that are inside of us. And getting exposure to natural environments can help beef up our access to healthy bacteria so that we can keep the right combination of good critters and, more good critters and fewer bad critters in our biome, which of course a lot of our highly overprocessed foods do not help us promote at all. There's evidence that things like the pink noise, so it's just kind of a term for certain sort of low frequency sounds like the crashing of waves or the rustling of the wind in the trees can promote slower brain waves, promote delta waves. So there's a whole bunch of interesting work being done on mechanisms for that. But it is also true that the built environment makes a difference. Walkable cities, for example, have direct and really reliable and strong correlations with people's mental health in that whole entire community, and we tend not to ignore that sort of stuff too, but probably we should be looking more at like what kind of neighborhood do you live in, and do they have the capacity to move in one that might be better for them in terms of their long-term mental health. We've just started looking at this in terms of trying to turn this into something that could be made part of a more clinical type of assessment, so self-report like our other measures are. And I think the one that's turning out the best so far is just how much access people have to green and blue spaces. And that's definitely the one that's got the most evidence in it and other types of scientific studies. But we're still early days with that. But I do just want to encourage you to try to think beyond just what's in our heads or even in our families or our school, our relationships with the people at our schools, and start thinking of the physical environment too. And then the last domain is regulatory, and I'm saving this one for last mostly because I know that this is where everybody goes when they think about resilience. Is again, you just got to be tough, you just got to push through, and or whatever. But that is not what we have found, and what we that's the most important element of this. And this came from qualitative work too. This came from some of the focus groups that we've done up here in the community where I live. I live in a very rural part of Tennessee in an area called the Cumberland Plateau. It's mostly pretty low income, especially outside the little bubble of the campus. And folks in this community, what they told us was that what really mattered to them is what we're calling positive emotion regulation, or what they would just say is like learning how to cheer themselves up. And so, of course, for those of you who are familiar with the research, there is a huge amount of research on emotion regulation, but almost all of it is on the regulation of negative emotions. So the DERS, the difficulties in emotion regulation scale, is probably the most widely used instrument. And it's all, I mean, even though people call it a measure of emotion regulation, like it just says in the name, it's actually a measure of being lousy at emotion regulation. And it all asks questions about having trouble dealing with feelings of sadness or distress for the most part. And then there's also another sort of subfield that focuses on anger management, but that's a negative emotion too. And what I'm sure everybody here knows well is that just because you're not angry or you're not sad, the absence of those negative emotions is not the same thing of having truly experiencing positive emotions. And so what they told us is that over time, what they got better and better at was learning how to cheer themselves up and how to get them back into a genuinely positive emotional state, or learn to laugh at the circumstances or whatever it was. There were a lot of different ways people did that. Sometimes they would crack jokes, sometimes they would listen to music, sometimes they go for a walk with their dogs, or maybe that one's just me. That's what I do when I need to cheer myself up. But I mean, it really almost didn't matter what it was. But of course, what you might notice about all of those strategies is that they are indirect strategies, and I think that is really important to think about, especially because I think, especially when you think about kids, like so many of our uh, communications with children are very regulatory based, like, don't cheat, do your homework, eat your vegetables, don't touch that, stop running, and just constantly regulatory message after regulatory message. And those really don't actually work that well for learning how to regulate. And so, what really helps mostly for regulation, I mean, the most evidence-based type of stuff, is to do what I call breath and body work. So, there's a lot of different things in that bucket: mindfulness, yoga, exercise, like we talked about before. Um, you could combine it with like gardening, which is a little nature stuff and a little exercise mixed together. I mean, there's lots of different ways. Or sometimes I get asked about martial arts. A lot of kids are in martial arts kind of classes. And those things are all good ways to help people learn how to regulate. Mindfulness, in particular, has a ton of really strong evidence for children and youth about being good for regulating, learning how regulatory skills, because you can't just say, like, okay, starting right now, I'm not going to be sad anymore, or starting right now, I'm going to be in a good mood. I mean, that doesn't really work. So we have to learn how to approach that a little bit more indirectly. Uh, but I will just close while saying that I think that this is a very positive time, and I just want to kind of shift to thinking about how we could change our interventions to look at all of this. I've talked about this a little bit, but so much of our interventions still tend to focus on psychoeducational types of information, or a lot of our interventions tend to, like cognitive behavioral stuff, focuses on coping or cognitive restructuring or things like that. But instead, what we really could be doing is spending more time thinking about what kinds of positives do children and families or adults need in their lives, and what kinds of things would help them bring some of these key strengths into their lives. And so, as the person who mentioned TFCBT for a sense of purpose, definitely one of the best tools is narrative, finding that space to tell your story. But also, and I think this is particularly true for young people, like letting them get involved in some kind of social justice activism or community activism. Vicky Banyard is doing a study with adolescents who are at risk for suicide, and that has been, a big element of what's coming out of that is the importance of activism in a lot of these kids' lives for both young people and for adults. Mentoring or volunteering, those are good kinds of things to do. I mean, it's kind of funny because, of course, one of the things we know from everybody having from the adverse childhood experiences stuff and the polyvictimization research is that almost all of us have been exposed to trauma. And, as I said, my own mission is really that I've spent much of my life devoted to is really directly tied to my childhood experiences of trauma, because it's to try to reduce the global burden of trauma. And we really need to get much more explicit about helping our clients find the same paths that have meant so much to so many of us in terms of figuring out pathways to well-being after we've experienced trauma. And there's a lot of really cool stuff. I don't have time to go into it all like right now, but there's a lot of really cool stuff that's happening with research on mentoring and things like that that show that it has not just well, I hate talking about psychological effects and physical effects as if they're different, because of course they're not really different. There's no sort of force field at our neck or anything like that, and all of these things are happening all through our bodies. But but still we do talk about them as if they're different. And so there is some cool stuff that mentoring or tutoring or things like that, those probably help the mentors and the tutors at least as much as the people who are being tutored, if not more than those people. And it does affect some of those markers of allostatic load and not just their self-report in much the same way as I was talking about the work on forest bathing. Um, for the interpersonal strengths, there's, gratitude interventions, I think are great things to do. I mean, that's one thing that I have done. One of the ones that I personally like in the gratitude intervention category are writing gratitude letters. I mean, I mentioned that one just because it's had so much research done for it. I don't know if it is necessarily like the only important one, but it is a well evidence-based intervention. And I like the ones that actually involve letters or visits. I'm sure probably a lot of you have heard of like the Count Your Blessings intervention or some of the other gratitude ones. And those are good too, as far as they go, but they really kind of keep you still focused on your individual self, and they aren't really helping you with your social networks, like reaching out to people and helping, reconnect with them or stay strongly connected with them. And we've done that. We did a program a couple of summers ago at the public library with gratitude letters, the one near here, and one of the things that really struck me about that is that we had 4 and 5-year-olds who were excited about doing that. And some of them couldn't even really write, but they draw a picture for their grandmother or whatever. And they were like super into that. But we also had really great participation from teenagers too. And it is very hard, in my experience, to find an activity that a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old are both happy to sit down and do. But, we brought cards and stamps and stuff. And that was really a great program that's been done. But and again for the environment, I already talked about, of course, for most people, it's not that hard to get out into the woods. And I do want to say that one of the great things about the forest bathing intervention is that it's a very accessible intervention because you don't have to do anything strenuous. I mean, as long as you've gone far enough into a down a trail or into a park so that you are more or less surrounded by green and you can't ideally like see the traffic or anything. You can, that's all that it takes. And so even people in wheelchairs or who have other types of mobility issues can usually access this. And people are starting to really even just bringing house plants into your house or starting to garden or things like that. That is good. And then we are uh, doing a project right now on safe spaces, which I would be happy to. We're just in the middle of doing interviews with it. It's really been a fascinating project. But I think trying to make your own space feel more supportive of your health and well-being can be a really powerful thing to do too, and just to make little tweaks with that. But I have a colleague here in the psychology department who has worked with some school programs in Nashville, and they have gone to the mayor in the city and asked for better crosswalks to reach some of the parks from some of their neighborhoods, and they've actually succeeded in getting the city of Nashville to put some crosswalks in. So it can seem like you might not really be able to have an impact on the built environment, but I think that that's more possible and that that's lower hanging fruit than they thought. I mean, they got a bunch of local news coverage. The mayor got all kinds of positive press. So there's lots of different kinds of things that you can do. And I just think that this is an incredibly optimistic and hopeful time to be thinking about this, and that we've really learned so much about the so much about what we can do to truly help people thrive after trauma, and so much better understanding of what people are doing, even if they don't have our help. And it has really given me a second wind in my career. And I hope that you find at least one of these ideas inspiring and something that you can take home too. And I think I'll go ahead and stop there, Etienne.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Sherry. And, we've known each other for, I think, 30 years, maybe more.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I enjoyed every you talk about a new phase of your career. I enjoyed every phase of your career. So looking forward to the next one. Thank you for the wonderful way you have to of helping us understand the importance of resilient science for our personal and collective well-being. We're not going to move to now to the our final discussion panel. And joining us in this session, we are honored to have another old friend of mine and a new friend of the Melissa Institute, Dr. Hugo Kamia. A native of Uganda, Hugo is a Fulbright scholar and the director of the PhD program at Smith College School of Social Work. His work threads interest in social work, psychology, and theology. So you will see the connections with a lot of what Sherry was speaking about. Hugo is the 2023 American Family Therapy Academy's recipient of the Distinguished Contribution to Social and Economic Justice Award and the author of the just released book, Narrative Practices for Resilience and Hope, Rewriting Stories of Trauma in Clinical Work, which, in alignment with Sherry Hamby's research, explores the interconnections of trauma, resilience, spirituality, and cultural identity, and offers insights into working with diverse populations. So let's get to it. We also have Deborah here with us. So Deborah, do you want to lead us?
I wanted to start by saying, Sherry, thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. And I've struggled myself with the notion that resilience is something that sits in the individual, because I think it comes through processes rather than interactive processes rather than the individual. And you've broken that out, and we can no longer look at a child and just say, well, that child's not resilient. And I think that was one of the traps of the focus on the individual. But I'm going to actually turn it over to Hugo, and then I'll ask a question after, if that's all right, because I would love to hear your conversations.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Etienne. Yes, our friendship goes back to at least almost 30 years now, and so nice to connect to. And again, thanks, Dr. Sherry Hamby. I heard a lot about you, so it's so nice to see you in person and to see how much you are, I like to say, engaging these ideas. The term I like to use is playing with these ideas and letting these ideas actually thrive, especially when we are talking about this in the context of children. So actually, when Etienne invited me to this panel, this conference, I was very excited because I think the resilience scholarship is really taking off quite a bit, and you've articulated it so well. Although there are so many issues that have to do with what constitutes resilience scholarship, whether it is in research, practice, I think the way you've highlighted issues that you are working with and really speaks to a very rich and emerging field. And as Dr. Pepler just said here a few minutes ago, yes, we get so focused on what's happening in the individual, and we need to think about it as a process, as an outcome, really a capacity, and this whole idea of interaction between individuals or collective communities with the environment in front of them. I really like the, sorry. Okay. I really like the whole idea of my work has been around narrative practices, and I'm so glad that you highlight that domain, which is the regulatory domain around how we sit with people and work with people on a daily basis. Because I think about that people's lives are rich in meaning, full of stories and rich in meaning. And our job as we work with them is to allow for the emergence of those asset-situated stories. So that whole idea of positivity that you highlight in your work and also in your talk really speaks very strongly to me. Because trauma tends really to hold people in negative storylines. And when I think about narrative practices, I think about they are about helping people see themselves outside these negative, emphasis-saturated stories. How we put it really becomes then a very important interaction. How it is also about putting together pieces that have been, if you will, dismembered. So this time, remembering them and having people really write their own relationship from memberships, whether it's to do with their relationships with others, the community that they are in, environment that they are. So, how about the gift of working with the young men and women from Sudan, the so-called Lost Boys of Sudan. So these are children who have been impacted by war, and a lot of their own connection to life in general has been disjointed. And so they are trying literally to put together their stories. This has been over 25 years now, and they're putting together their stories there. And part of it is also trying to elevate their voices, having those voices connected together, putting that membership together and allowing themselves to revise their memberships. How we do this really becomes important. So sort of connecting to our identities, connecting to our experiences beyond just that one storyline, which very often the negative trauma often suggests as a negative story. So I can want that, and of course with that comes the racial trauma. I have you as it's a resilience science actually really influences, education, mental health, social work, public health, disaster response, as we had from the previous speaker, or even refugee issues. How do we translate this research into equitable policies and around policies today in the country that we live in? So I'll stop there. I have a couple more other issues, but I would be curious what you have to say about that, the translation of this resilience science or resilience ideas that you present to us today. Oh, by the way, I should also add, I love this whole idea of forest bathing because I come from Africa, and one of the things that we try to do when we connect with nature is we have this sense of harmony with nature. And so we actually are out in the fields with the soil, with the land, with the water, with the mountains. So I really love that whole idea. And I think it's so important to really, really harness that aspect of our connection to who we are. So I'll stop there.
All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for all those comments and all your work. I think that you might be touching on, as far as the policy piece. Maybe I'll just start by sharing, because I'm sure you're aware of this, but maybe not everybody listening is that in some quarters, the concept of resilience has really become very controversial, because I think especially in the global South, so maybe you've encountered this yourself, that it has, it can feel like we're putting, especially the older ideas, these individualistic ideas that about just toughing it out and everything, that it can feel like we're putting the burden on individual people or kids or families to deal with all of these traumas, when a lot of the traumas, like you said, are really collective traumas, and why should we all be healing individually from that? But even for the ones that are not, and I think also that a lot of traumas that we think of as interpersonal traumas have collective elements too. So the ways that, that patriarchy, for example, enables domestic violence and sexual assault. And so a lot of our conversation, especially in psychological types of spaces, can ignore that. And so that is something I have tried to address very directly in my book. I devote a chapter in the book about, well, I mean, the whole book talks about really needing to make a much more explicit link between resilience and social justice and individual healing and collective healing. But there's one chapter in particular that really tries to unpack some of these ideas. And so I do think that what you're talking about is very important, in that we, and that for the most part, I think that the way to do that is to hopefully try to get some virtuous cycles going. So instead of vicious cycles where it's like bad stuff creating more bad stuff, and of course a lot of survivors are well familiar with getting caught up in those. So a virtuous cycle is when good things can lead to more good things, and I think either survivors themselves, or I think that all of us can try to contribute. I mean, that's actually the whole reason I wrote this book for a general audience. It's my first time not writing a book that's more of a nerdy academic book with a university press type of thing. And you know what? It was actually really hard. It was a lot. In fact, if I appreciated how hard it was going to be at the beginning, maybe I would not have taken it on. Although it has been a really great process, and my editors and some of the other folks who have looked at earlier drafts, they've just, I mean, the people at Penguin were just amazing to work with, and have been slowly but surely helping me get better at communicating in ways that, where I don't have to include, 10 statistics and 3 qualifications for every time I say something. But I do think that we need to do more to try to make this information accessible to people. I think we need to think about, I mean, especially in the United States. I mean, I'm totally jealous of you and every single other Canadian, Deborah, for your national health, services, and of course, most of the rest of the wealthy democracies in the world, which have these much better access to healthcare than we do. So I do think we, as a field, it would like to see us working more on multiple fronts and not get completely caught up with what in social work, at least I know they call it the micro pipeline. And I just saw a really great talk about this at Resilience Con a few weeks ago. His team from Rutgers came down, and they just talked about how in their school of social work that almost all of the students end up choosing, maybe choosing is not the right word, but for whatever kind of a range of reasons, they all end up getting shunted into the micro pipeline, which is the one where they become individual service providers or individual therapists or case managers or whatever the case may be. And hardly any of them, even though there's a track there to do more macro stuff and work on policy and things like that, that hardly any of them end up completing their degree with the macro track. And I'm sorry that I said the word choosing, because I really don't think that it is choosing. I think that there's a lot of ways that our system, I mean, the thing about the micro pipeline is it never changes the system. Like, we could go out tomorrow and we could double the number, or we could triple the number of social workers and school counselors and therapists that are out there, and the system would just absorb them. They're like, come on in. You guys are no threat to us. We can take as many of those as you can throw at us, and it is not going to change the way the system works. And if we really want to make the kinds of changes you're talking about, we're going to have to figure out a way to invest more resources in that, what they were calling macro pipeline. And those words have just really stuck with me ever since I saw that talk. And the thing is that the system doesn't like that. I mean, they don't, they make it harder to get, there's not as many jobs there, I mean, there's not There's no, I mean, no, do you ever see that on TV? I mean, is that, we were talking about like kids trying on different types of identity ideas when they're little. And so they understand vet and they understand firefighter and they understand teacher and things like that. And then they don't get too much older before they might even start to understand therapist or, or I don't know, X-ray technician or other kinds of different healthcare jobs or EMT or things like that. But when do they figure out that going into policy making is an option? I mean, we never really introduce that in a way that that becomes something that people can start visualizing and trying that on as an identity hat. So I think that we've got to figure out how to do that.
Can I introduce something?
Of
Yes,
course.
go ahead. Dan.
Please.
Well, first of all, Sherry, thank you for the terrific presentation. I recently had an occasion when the mental health community of the country of Ukraine asked me to talk to them about resilience. And I think you would find it kind of interesting as to the variety of coping techniques that they evidence in getting, first of all, it turns out that in the city of Kiev, the city river freezes over. And on Friday nights, you have the entire community come together for an ice skating party. This is a war-torn area. The other thing that they reported to me, and in fact, this entire presentation is on the Melissa Institute website with a translation, is they had the illusion, and I characterize it as an illusion, that during the morning there was a safe time when they would be able to go shopping or take their kids out for bike rides to play or like. Now the reason I call it an illusion is no one could predict when a drone is going to come over Kiev. But the notion that people had to have a belief that they had some kinds of control was really very therapeutic. It's a different kind of notion of how to get emotional regulation apropos of your model. I can go ahead and give you multiple other examples of how this community, where they had 30,000 children who had been abducted to Russia, who are under the uncertainty of the war experiences, who having lost, who are evident in evident and trying to demonstrate resilience in spite of all the difficulties they have. I thought you might find those particular examples of interest.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do find that interesting. I've done a little bit of work with a professor named Kaltrina Kelmendi in Kosovo, which is a post-conflict society from the wars that led to the splitting up of the former Yugoslavia. And one of the concepts there that I think kind of speaks to Hugo's question too, that I've just found fascinating because when, in fact, every time I have mentioned meaning making up until now, I have really talked about it mostly as an individual process, like you decide you're going to be a vet or whatever.
Right.
And but one of the concepts that came out of the work that we did there, I thought was this beautiful collective idea of meaning making because, as some of you might know, they established themselves as a new country just in 2008. So that's within the memory of most of the adults there. And they really, you can feel it. I've been there just for a couple of short trips, and as soon as they find out they're from the United States, they just want to tell you this whole story about how they're on what we call this nationwide meaning making process, and that they've all really signed on, not all of them, that would be an exaggeration, but a lot of them have really signed on to this joint effort of trying to reform this country and create this new identity. And it is just been a powerful way that I think has helped them get through, because you can still see the evidence. I mean, that war, the bombings in Kosovo were in 1998 and 99, so it's getting to be more than 25 years ago now, but you can still see the effects of it, especially in Pristina, where the capital city where most of it happened. There's still bombed out, blocks and things like that, and piles of rubble that they don't really know where to move. And so, I mean, they've certainly struggled as being a post-conflict society, but one of the ways that they are moving forward and finding ways through that difficult challenge is definitely through this kind of feeling that they're all participating on this country making process together. And I think that those are the kinds of things that we really don't do enough listening to lots of different communities who have gone through things like that and figured out what they're doing about it. And your story about Kiev, I mean, of course, they're obviously still going through it, but finding ways to still connect as community members, I think it's just amazing and powerful, and something that we don't give enough credit to the impact of those kinds of processes.
In Kiev, the interesting thing is that the meaning making has to do with patriotism, not
Sure.
spirituality so much, but the patriotism is a way in which they elicit the support of a group. The meaning making is not only individual, but it's of the community.
Yeah, we in our model, there you can have individual and collective elements in all four of the domains. And in classic kind of psychology or social science, we have mostly focused on the individual elements in meaning making and regulatory, and the collective elements in the relational and environmental stuff. But there, and it might be a kind of a big talk to unpack it in all four of them, you can unpack how it can manifest at both of those levels for each of those. And I do think it is really important to think about that.
I agree. Thank you for that terrific presentation.
And thank you, Don.
Deborah?
Yeah, I just want to hop in for a minute. The discussion that you've been having, Hugo and Sherry, really helps me think about the Indigenous communities where we've been working, because they're a very collective culture, collective groups, and the trauma has been collective, and so the restabilization, I think, needs to be collective. So it's given me a lot of ideas, and we've developed what we call a starting place story, where they gather the stories of harm and their vision of wellness, and then their critical cultural strengths. But I also wanted to jump in and just talk about safe spaces, because Sherry, you mentioned that, and it really meant a lot to me. I've had the opportunity to work at Breaking the Cycle, which is a program for substance using women and their very young children, 0 to 6. And the program's been going for 30 years, and I've been with them for that time. And I've watched them work more skillfully and skillfully at creating a safe space. So it's sort of a one-stop place where the women can come from 9 to 5, and the relationships are safe, and all of the relationships model safety and trust in relationships, and the space and then the needs are met in a safe way, so that there's breakfast and lunch served, and there's beautiful playrooms and lovely spaces, and I've thought a lot about that in terms of schools, and my work in bullying and trying to ensure that peer relationships are healthy. And I have to say, schools in Canada and the ones that I've been in Miami often don't feel safe. And youth are put into contexts where I wouldn't be safe as an adult. And, there are too many people in the hall at the same time. There are too many opportunities to to experience harm, and often the adults aren't out, being relational with the students. So there's so much to think about in terms of what you've both presented. And I thank you so much for that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for those comments. I got interested in the safe spaces. I mean, it's such a buzzword, but it came up a lot in one of the scoping reviews that my student Madison Reed led, and she was interested in resilience among people with learning disabilities, so dyslexia or other things like that. And that was a theme that came up in a lot of those different ones because there was a lot more just because I mean, it's funny how all of these literature, like they all say they're on resilience, but because of the nature of the populations, they all kind of come at it from a little bit different angle. And so in this one, because of the focus on learning disabilities, there was a ton of stuff about the educational environment. And so I think that's why there was so much on safe spaces. But when we dug into it, I mean, if you Google safe spaces or even in Google Scholar, you'll just find thousands and thousands and thousands of papers on it. But we were really surprised about how little empirical literature there is on it. And there's very little that has been done. It's a lot of just more stuff about people's clinical experiences or curricular or policy types of things. And of course, there's this whole space of critiquing how safe spaces are bad and what you need are brave spaces and like all the kind of stuff. But yeah, we have found that. I mean, we have found some things that have been really surprising to me. And a lot of what has been coming out of these interviews when we have been asking people about times where they really felt they could talk about something that was difficult to talk about, which is where the angle we've been mostly taking in the interview, uh, is that there hasn't been much reference to spaces that people are in a lot. It's been amazing to me how many of them talk about going on camping trips or road trips. There's been a lot of road trips where they're just in the car and they're both looking ahead and they're not looking at each other. And of course, any of you have got teenagers. I mean, I've got a 22-year-old son, and that's still pretty much how I, get him to talk about things that he doesn't talk about. This I wait till we have to go somewhere in the car that's a long drive. But I do think that those kinds of elements are important, and that we have lost the thread about what kids really need when they are in educational spaces. And we have gotten, I mean, it's gotten so focused on security issues and other kind of behavioral issues. And I think that we were probably uh, creating problems because we're creating all of these environmental cues that this is a dangerous space. And I think that we're probably either a lot of that is probably even backfiring and in ways. And so I do think it's mostly a very sad situation especially in the U.S. public school system right now. And uh, but yeah, the nicest school I personally ever saw is one because we were doing a study abroad semester when my daughter was kindergarten age, and we put her in kindergarten in a very small town in northern Italy, in the Tyrolean part of Italy. So the schools were all German speaking there, and it was just amazing to me how wonderful and nice that space was, and how. I mean, it was basically kind of like a Montessori. It wasn't a Montessori school by name, but I think it was basically that approach that was very self-directed, and they had all these like they had this whole Lego station, and then they also had this place where you could just kind of go in this little curtained area and get away from the other kids if you needed to, and you didn't need permission for that. There's whole crafts station that was just open all the time, and they all ate their lunch together on these tables that were set with real china and real glassware. And I just don't know like when, and I think that all of that stuff just helped give all of these cues that this is a nice place, and you guys deserve nice things. And you know what, I feel like we have really, really lost that. Honestly, you know, nowhere she's gone since then has been anywhere near as nice.
Thank you, Sherry, very much for this wonderful presentation and super engaging discussion, and for being so responsive to all these requests that I keep making you from the Institute. We need you for this. We need you for this. And you have never said no. I appreciate.
Yeah.
I know we have a lot of board members and founders in the audience today that appreciate you just as much. And thank you very much. You're one of the newest members of our scientific advisory group, but you've been so active since you joined in, and we're really grateful to you. And I know I also speak for Don and others when I say that we are going to move now to the closing remarks and special recognition section. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, appreciative of everybody most of you have stuck together with us through the whole day. It's a tribute to you and of your commitment to really help create a better world. As we come to the close to the Melissa Institute's 30th annual conference, this extraordinary event that we just witnessed, and I know you will carry with you for at least another year until we meet again on the 31st. I'm pleased to invite Dr. Deborah Pepler to share a special message to conclude our time together.
Thank you so much, Etione, and thank you to the presenters. It was and the commentators in the question period. It was a wonderful, informative day, and I think we've all leaned in many different ways to support the youth mental health crisis, not only in America, around the world. I do want to just make a special thanks to Lynn and Michael Appman, who had such a positive response to life's greatest stressor, losing a child. And they've generously contributed to this movement of knowledge and science into practice over the last 30 years, which has been such a generous contribution to the field and to children, youth, and families. I also want to mention Susan Keeley, because it was Susan who brought Don Meichenbaum in to imagine what the Melissa Institute could be and how they could make such a huge impact for this. But then I want to end by making a special tribute to Don Meichenbaum. I met Don in 1976. I was a new doctoral student, and I was his TA in a developmental psychology class. And wow, did I ever meet a giant of a man, and a man who's been a model and a hero of mine throughout the last 30 years. He has so much passion for the work that he does. And I think Don has many superpowers in a sense. He is so motivating and so committed to moving science into practice and ensuring that science gets taken up in ways that are really practical for parents and teachers and clinicians working with children and youth, trying to prevent violence and treat it. And I think it's this in the where Don's strengths lies. He's strong in research. He's exceptionally strong in clinical skills and was identified as one of the top 10 clinicians in the US. But it's this bridge that Don provides between research and practice. And he always asks the question, but what does this mean for people on the ground who are working with children and youth? And this is part of where his magic lies, because he not only asks what it means, but how do we develop a checklist for that? Or how do we develop a tool for people to pick up? And, I can remember chatting with Don about, how you ensure that your children find a good partner. Now, that's a really important life lesson. And you surely don't want them to find a partner who's aggressive and violent. And we were, under the Melissa Institute umbrella, and that was a really important issue. But sure enough, didn't Don come up with a checklist for all the things that you should ask your daughter when she's starting to date a young man? And it's amazing. His mind never stops. And that's been a huge contribution to the Melissa Institute. And when you go and visit and look at all of the items, the resources that Don has contributed that are all available on the Melissa Institute website. The Melissa Institute has benefited hugely from Don's mind and his huge heart. He took the Melissa Institute under his wing.
I invite all of the attendees to download our annual report. Because 30 years ago, we started out with no money, with limitations, and with the help of the admins, we've now gone to an endowment of $1 million, and I continue to work. In fact, Sherry, we just put out a book on constructive narrative perspectives as a coping technique and using meaning making. And I'm sure you'll find that particular approach consistent with your own. So thank you once again. And thanks to Etione for putting this together. He is a super guy. Okay.
Okay, Don, I'm going to just sign off and thank you to everyone for 30 years of incredible work. It's been amazing, and thanks for inspired leadership from so many people, the ones who've been around for quite a while and those who've joined recently and are carrying this. So thank you so much and have a good weekend.
You too.
Yeah, thank you all. Keep in touch and keep doing the work that needs to be done, because the world needs you now more than ever. Thank you all. Thank all the presenters, Sherry, Hugo, Deborah, and everybody else that came before. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend now.